Let me start first by welcoming everyone to today's public forum of the Institute of Security and International Studies at Chulalongkorn University. Our topic is geopolitical turbulence and geoeconomic conflict, implications and consequences for Thailand and Southeast Asia. I actually made up the topic, I didn't remember. But it basically, today we are interested, the aim is to update, focus on what's been happening. We're interested in two trends: what's happened in the world, how it affects Thailand and the region, Southeast Asia. And second, we are interested in anticipating what might come next. The Trump administration, second Trump administration, is approaching, is 6 months now in office, and I think that there's been a lot of turbulence, a lot of changes on the ground. President Trump has imposed so-called reciprocal tariffs on the whole world. Everyone gets something. He's very fair, but some get more than others. So in Southeast Asia, Cambodia has been slapped with a 49% tariff, Laos 48%, Vietnam 46%, Thailand 36%, Indonesia 32%, Malaysia 24%, even Singapore, which has a trade deficit, not a trade surplus with the US, also has been levied 10%. This is the baseline bottom, minimum tariff. But the tariff offensive reflects something else. It comes across as the US being, if I may use the American lingo, the US is pissed off. They're pissed off. They're angry. They're angry at the world. The Trump second administration is angry at the international system, because otherwise, why would he impose 10% minimum tariff on everybody, on every country, every territory? So they're really angry at something. And the object of anger is the international system. Somehow, the Trump administration, they think that the international system has been unfair, has so-called ripped them off. They feel ripped off. They feel very grievous, resentful. I want to draw a distinction between Trump, the president, Trump the man, and Trump the movement. The strands and drive behind Trump actually has been around for some time, has been percolating since the 1980s, you can even say longer. In the process of trying to come to terms with what's been happening, I went back to look at some old books, and there's an old article from the spring of 1990. It was in the National Interest magazine, semi-policy, semi-academic journal, and from the spring of 1990. And the title of the article was called America First, Second, and Third. And the person who wrote it was a guy named Patrick Buchanan. So in the 1980s, at the end of the Cold War, the US had a big debate about what they should do. And there was a small faction within the Republican Party, and they said, it's time to come home. We won the Cold War, we won the Second World War, and we've suffered. We have heavy debt, we have had losses of lives, enough of the imperial America, and they want to come home. Focus on infrastructure at home, focus on the healthcare system, focus on the welfare and education and so on. But they lost the debate. The majority of the Republican Party, the Bush family, for example, they won the debate, the established Republicans. And they went on to, as we saw in the 2000s, the global war on terror. In the 1990s, even under Clinton, they were still internationally engaged. So the Democratic Party, Republican Party, until Trump, had a common basis of international engagement. Now, Trump basically, as a manifestation, embodiment of this movement, which has two sides to it. At home is a kind of a nativist, anti-immigrant nativist movement, internally focused, inward-looking, isolationist. Outside is economic nationalism, protectionism, mercantilism, tariffs. At home, you build a wall to keep out the immigrants. Abroad, you impose tariffs to gain more income, but also to bring down all the other countries in the international system that have benefited from America's role as the main underwriter, funder, underwriter, and security provider of the international system. So it's been breathtaking, but I think that we have to draw a distinction between Trump, the man, and he's transactional. He's very can be fickle. He can change from one day to the next. But the basis of his presidency is a movement. So that's a kind of the lay of the land. I mean, the context, and I think for Southeast Asia, this is a big challenge, big problem for us. Southeast Asia has already been divided over a range of issues: Myanmar, coup, civil war, the Russia-Ukraine war, South China Sea, US-China conflict. I mean, Southeast Asia is really divided. And now with the Trump tariffs, the Trump tariffs will force Southeast Asia to become more competitive. Southeast Asian economies will be more competitive vis-a-vis each other because they all have an interest in negotiating the tariffs to bring the tariffs down. There will not be a uniform tariff. So the US tariff for Southeast Asia, for Thailand, will be varied. Some countries will get a number, and other countries will get another number. And that means that all these countries in Southeast Asia will have to compete to sell in the US market. So for Thailand, we have only had one round of talk, negotiations round, and Vietnam has already had 3. It looks like Vietnam will get a deal. Thailand, maybe not. It could be that President Trump will just come up with different numbers from different countries. We don't know. So this morning I would like to recognize all the speakers that we've assembled a good mix of speakers and experts and analysts. Mr. Richard Yarrow from the US, he'll give us a US view. He's a research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's currently a visiting fellow with ISIS Thailand. Ajahn Dr. Tang Nirand with the Faculty of Law. He has spent some years in the US, but also China. He's our kind of Thailand's China expert, if you will. China, US, speaks Chinese. And then Ajahn Pavida Pananont, an expert scholar on the global value chain. So she'll talk a little bit about tariff and how it impacts companies, multinationals, and also economies, how the tariffs will be handled and redirected, the supply chains will be reconfigured. And then I'll come to Ajahn Thitipat Phunkam, who's from Thammasat, Faculty of Political Science, and he'll give us a bit of a broader view on the geostrategic environment and where we go from here, what will likely happen next, what we can maybe anticipate. So if you will, this will be a little bit of a intellectual entertainment, maybe some policy, a policy-related journey that we'll do for the next couple of hours together, and I'll try to pitch in along the way. On that note, let me first invite Richard Yarrow to give us a little bit of a, what's happened here and where's it come from, this whole Trump movement and the tariffs and what's going on in Washington. And I'll also say that the Middle East conflicts have a bearing on Southeast Asia. I wonder if the Trump administration can have its eyes on so many different balls, right? I mean, they focus now on Iran, the Israeli-Iranian conflict, and then they have Russia-Ukraine in Europe. And eventually, I think the Trump administration is focused on China. But can they have so many different theaters of geostrategic engagements and conflicts? So maybe we come to you first, Richard. Give us a bit of a foretaste, preview, and analysis of what's happened. Please.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Ajahn Thitinan. I'm honored to be here in this panel with both old friends and new friends. I've been given the relatively difficult or not so enviable task of trying to defend American policy over the last few years. So I will need to begin with some of the usual caveats and a few extra caveats. First, what I'm going to say does not represent the views of my institution, Harvard Kennedy School, or ISIS Thailand. And what I'm going to say does not even necessarily represent my own views. So we can delve into those a little more in the question and answer and discussion later. I'm going to talk about what are the driving factors and what are the rationales for American trade policy over the last 5 or 10 years. I'm going to try to talk a little bit about what are the goals, where does trade policy seem to be going or aiming for, and then what can other countries do, or how might other countries respond to Trump's trade wars. So the first major rationale or major driver that I want to bring up is a basic macroeconomic one. Since the late 1970s, early 1980s, the US economy has been defined by very, very large capital inflows into the United States and corresponding high and growing trade deficits. Normally, we think of the trade side, the current account side, but the capital account side is arguably at least, if not more important than the actual trade and goods element in terms of the macroeconomics of trade issues. What do these large capital inflows mean? They consist of governments and central banks around the world trying to accumulate large or growing reserves of either US dollars or US dollar denominated assets. They consist of wealthy individuals or wealthy corporations around the world trying to diversify, gain access to US markets, purchase high value American real estate. And maybe in particular, they consist of governments with a kind of industrial policy agenda trying to prevent the appreciation of their own local currencies, which would hurt their own export competitiveness, and in turn preventing that appreciation by acquiring as many US dollars as possible in order to drive up the value of the US dollar or prevent the repatriation of wealth into their own countries. For the US economy, this means the value of the US dollar has been relatively high or higher than one might think it should be in terms of trade. Demand to convert from the US dollar into other currencies, whether it's the Chinese renminbi, Japanese yen, Thai baht, and so forth, is relatively lower. And this currency balance, in effect, reduces the competitiveness of all kinds of US-made products, both within US markets and for export to other markets around the world, further incentivizing greater imports of products from elsewhere in the world into the United States. This does not necessarily have a bad effect for the US economy overall, but it does force a change in the structural composition of the US economy, which is more or less what we've seen since the 1970s. So with a relatively higher US dollar, with relatively greater incentives for imports instead of exports in the United States, one sees a shift of resources away from traditional manufacturing type industries and into any kind of sectors or industries that might benefit from financial inflows. These include obvious sectors like real estate and banking and finance, but also some of the less obvious sectors that are downstream from banking and finance, including maybe elite universities that benefit from foreign students and foreign donations, maybe venture capital firms that benefit from a surplus of spare resources or spare investable money in the United States, startup firms that benefit from the venture capital growth, and also the high-tech industry, most importantly. Now, high-tech and areas like high-tech do create productivity growth in the US, and we've seen the US economy is not in a depression. The US economy has grown relatively well over the last 25 years, but at the same time, the kinds of employment and the kinds of benefit from tech or other related industries, tech, finance, venture capital, elite universities, benefit and create employment in a few areas and create relatively limited employment compared to manufacturing that used to create employment in much broader areas across the country. So think about the growth of Google, Facebook, NVIDIA, other firms which have acquired enormous valuations, but they've contributed to growth around the Silicon Valley area, which is a few towns in California. Contrast that with the relative decline of the overall Midwest states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, and Indiana. The macroeconomic response to this shift in recent years, or in the last 10 years more or less, has been to try to revive American manufacturing in order to revive employment in many places and lift up economic growth in a broader swath of the country. And this really can be done through 4 different tactics or 4 different sets of policies. One tactic that we saw in the 1980s is to try to pressure or have negotiations with other leading governments in order to pseudo-voluntarily appreciate their own currencies and help depreciate the US dollar. This is basically the strategy during the Plaza Accord time. It didn't really work very well, but that's one tactic. Another tactic which the Biden administration pursued is through industrial policy, very heavy state spending in order to try to stimulate manufacturing or different industries. We're kind of waiting to see how well that tactic will work. Another tactic, third tactic, and one that was highlighted actually just a few days ago by Martin Wolf, a British columnist in the Financial Times, is to try to force down the value of the US dollar by forcing out foreign investors in the United States. That could be through hard controls or through taxing all money that is entering the United States. That has not really been tried yet, or at least in recent decades, but Congress is actually increasingly threatening to do that. The proposals have been gaining momentum in Congress. And then the final tactic simply is the one that Trump has done, which is try to follow a strategy of managed trade or tariffs that force other countries to negotiate or reduce some of their trade surpluses. So that's the macroeconomic agenda. We might say there's also a political rationale or political driver. If you look at the country or the areas of the US that benefit from free trade, benefit from open financial accounts, they tend to be places in more democratic-leaning states, places with Silicon Valley, with elite finance, Wall Street, elite universities. So we might think at some level Trump might not mind so much pursuing a macroeconomic strategy that probably disproportionately affects some democratic-leaning parts of the United States. And then finally, we have a security rationale. The US had 2 major wake-up calls around the interplay between trade policy, industrial policy, and American national security or geopolitical needs. The first came during COVID when US federal policymakers realized that a lot of the supply chains for basic, relatively low-end, relatively low-value medical supplies were located outside the United States and beyond the immediate control or immediate oversight of American policymakers. These include things like masks, maybe ventilators, maybe some basic pharmaceutical ingredients, basic active ingredients in different pharmaceuticals. And these are not particularly growth drivers. Maybe nobody wants to build an economy around people manufacturing millions of rubber gloves. But on the other hand, if you're in a medical emergency, it doesn't really matter if you can design the most advanced vaccines or the most advanced pharmaceuticals if you can't produce the pharmaceuticals themselves or the kinds of equipment needed around the pharmaceuticals. So that was one wake-up call. The second wake-up call related to what was referenced on the Middle East is security, really hard kind of security issues. Starting with the war in Ukraine, leading into the recent conflicts in the Middle East, and combined with the escalating pressure for the US government to maintain at least some adequate base of supplies to defend Taiwan or to defend American forces in East Asia and the Pacific in the event of a crisis closer to here. The US has come under an increasing awareness that the much storied and much feared military-industrial complex of old is really direly deficient and direly insufficient for meeting present-day industrial production needs associated with current military needs in traditional armaments. Since the war in Ukraine, basically the military supplies of most of our continental European allies have been severely depleted. If a wider war breaks out, it's not clear where the kinds of munitions, armaments, basic weaponry is going to be found. And it's not clear that enough countries in either the European Union or places within the United States are really capable of scaling up quickly and efficiently enough in order to meet the needs of a wider conflict. This has sparked a focus on the civilian types of industries that are needed to support military-related industries and military maintenance needs. That includes having a domestic metals industry that can rapidly scale up, serve civilian needs in peacetime, but can rapidly scale up and serve military needs in the event of war. That includes having a base of engineers who work in civilian industries during most of the time, but can rapidly help retool factories or build and reshape factories in the event of an emergency, as well as areas like shipbuilding, where the United States has discovered, to its dismay, that the US can produce maybe at best one ship a year, while China produces a majority of the new ships every year. All of these issues, some of these issues are not particularly new. I think the trade and macroeconomic issues on their own are not particularly new from similar kinds of trade disruptions or trade tensions that we saw in the 1970s around President Nixon blowing up the gold standard, gold-based financial system, around President Reagan initiating the Plaza Accords negotiations, and so on and so forth. The security issues are relatively new. The depletion of military-linked industries or emergency-related industries, whether for military or medical needs, is something that the United States is newly experiencing compared to during the Cold War. Where is this going? I'll try to be quick because I know we need to move on. I think to some extent, the US is trying to pursue a fortress North America strategy, even if the US cannot reshore all of its industries to the United States proper. There's a goal or vision of reshoring enough industries into North America overall that the US government could have some significant influence over industries in the event of a crisis. Elbridge Colby, I think one of the undersecretaries of defense in particular, is associated with this. Next, I think the US is looking for a strategy around negotiations of really solving or addressing any of the rationales that I talked about, whether it's political, bringing manufacturers into constituencies that support Trump or will vote for Trump, whether it's a macroeconomic agenda of mediating trade deficits, or whether it's looking for security guarantees or stronger security cooperation in different places. And if that fails, Trump's chief economic advisor, Stephen Moran, has talked a bit about prospects of US benefiting from currency revaluations around the world, which I can talk more about in a question and answer period. So what can other countries do? Well, first I'd point out that some of the American trade demands are not particularly unreasonable, and they certainly are not partisan and linked specifically just to the Trump administration. If one looks at some of the demands that Washington has made on Thailand, many of them actually would seem to benefit Thai industries, the efficiency of the Thai economy, and Southeast Asia more generally. Areas like reducing corruption in customs processing, for instance, reducing some of the relatively arbitrary looking or steep regulations and steep import duties on intermediate goods that in fact hurt efficiency in some Thai manufacturing industries. And then second, I'd note, given the range of different rationales and range of different motivators for these trade wars and trade conflicts, there are also a range of different ways that Southeast Asian and other countries can respond, whether it's focusing specifically on the security element, as countries like maybe Vietnam, maybe Japan are doing, whether it's focusing on investments, as maybe Japan did with its US Steel deal, or whether it's focusing on overall trade balances. So because there's not just one driver of the Trump trade war, there might also not be one solution that countries can pursue in mitigating their economic hassles. Hopefully that addresses some of the points, and I'm happy to talk more about it later on.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me ask just a very quick follow-up question to Richard. The Trump administration's demands on Thailand, there are two fronts. One is the Chinese transshipments, and then addressing the deficit. The deficit itself is going to take a long time. If you can buy more stuff from the U.S., but a $45.6 billion deficit, it'll take years to bring that down. But on the Chinese transshipment, very quick follow-up question. What do we do now with China wants to sell? So China is a big manufacturing, has excess capacity. Everybody wants to sell. And once the U.S. does not buy the same way, we're in trouble. I mean, how do you see China is going to compete with Southeast Asia? Can China become a buyer? I don't see that happening, but this is the big problem in the region now. We're seeing some Chinese dumping in the Thai economy, but in other markets in Southeast Asia, and price undercutting, EVs, for example. And this is detrimental for the Thai economy. What do you think about the China factor or the China competition here?
Great question, and maybe some of my colleagues on this panel will try to address that as well. I mean, I think on the transshipment area, it's another issue that it really would benefit Thailand to address more strongly too. Thailand has existing laws limiting these kinds of transshipments, establishing harder criteria for what products get labeled as made in Thailand, what products get Board of Investments incentives for being made in Thailand. And I'm not sure those laws are being properly enforced. Having stronger or more rigorous enforcement probably is not going to be bad for Thai industry or Thai environmental conditions overall. Whether Thailand can find alternative markets is extremely difficult. Right now, one sees Thai products have actually been experiencing declining market shares in other ASEAN markets overall, in part because Chinese products, Chinese goods are just so competitive and so cheaper. So I'm not sure how to really answer that or if there is any good solution. It's a difficult challenge.
Okay, thank you. We'll come back to you also on the issues of currencies and exchange rate adjustments, and also the manufacturing, variable that the Trump administration wants to regain or bring them back, and to what extent that can be, if that is possible. Let me come now to Ajahn Am. Kind of, China is a big deal for us. In fact, now ASEAN is the biggest economic partner of China. China sells a lot here, invests a lot here too, but we've become dependent on China, not just Thailand, but Southeast Asian economies. And but it's a different kind of dependency. For the US, they're actually a big buyer. For China, they're a big seller. And so when we rely on them for technology, for tourism and so on, it's one thing, but they all compete with us to sell. And all the things happening in China with Xi Jinping's third term and what China has done this time, I noticed the Chinese are much more prepared for Trump 2 than Trump 1. They're much more diversified. They have de-risked from the US under Trump 2 to a significant degree. How do you see this US-China moving forward? And they have a kind of a deal, but I don't know how long-lasting that will be. And the Chinese has this, they have a big leverage, the Chinese. They have these rare earth elements, the rare earth exports that the US needs, and apparently the whole world needs. So China is really, formidable, daunting to deal with. Ajahn Am.
Thank you very much, Professor Thitinan, and I'm honored to join this distinguished panel. I recently met with a delegation from a leading Beijing think tank, doing a studying tour, speaking with multiple stakeholders in Thailand. And when I met them, I asked them, what are their findings? And especially my question is, what are the surprising findings? So what surprised them when they talk to these various business leaders in Thailand? And they said three points, three things. The first one is that they were surprised that the narrative, Professor Thitinan, in Thailand about the flow of Chinese goods, about Chinese dumping, about Chinese overcapacity, is roughly very similar to the narrative in the West and the narrative in Europe. In Europe, we all have this issue about Chinese EVs going into the market, the flows of Chinese goods. So they were surprised that we have similar narrative here in ASEAN, in Thailand, in Southeast Asia, compared to all these Western narratives that are very mainstream right now in Western media. But he noted that they note that they seem that the Thais are more positive. The Thais are still welcome. We have still the welcoming attitude towards Chinese investment, but we just say that we want to emphasize these problems and acknowledge and solve these problems. But the overall tone from the Thai side is still to welcome Chinese trade, Chinese investment. The second point that they make is that this is not intentional, from the Chinese side, meaning that it's not the Chinese government's policy to dump these goods, and it's very hard to control because this is happening because of the trade war with the U.S. Goods from China cannot go to the U.S. They need to find other markets. It's about the very intense competition within the Chinese market and the slowdown of the Chinese economy. So if you are Chinese entrepreneurs, you have to go out. You have to go to Southeast Asia. You have to come to Thailand because you cannot survive within the domestic Chinese market. Is so difficult to compete, so intense. So you need to if you want growth, you need to come to Thailand, to Southeast Asia, to compete and to find the new market. And the price war is also derived from all these Chinese business environments. The third point that they made is that from their study trip and from speaking to all these different Thai stakeholders, they want to find some proposed solutions, proposed policy recommendations to the Chinese government. And they said it's very difficult to propose policy recommendations to the Chinese government because, as I mentioned, there's a lot of unintentional behaviors and actions by small and medium Chinese enterprise and entrepreneurs, and it's very difficult to say, what the Chinese governments or the Chinese leadership can do to address all these problems effectively. So I start with this anecdote. Now, problems in China and the change in the Chinese economy has a very big impact on Thailand. Professor Thitinan mentioned tourism. The Chinese tourists, from the start of the year, the amount of Chinese tourists coming to Thailand have dropped, I think around 30 to 40%. Of course, some people would say, we get tourists from other countries, we get more top-tier tourists, more spending. But if you talk to businesses in the tourist industries, there's a big impact. And actually, last year, the new growth portion of the Thai economy all came from tourism. So I think this year the economy will be hit very hard because we have problems with export, we have problems with investment, and we also now have problems with tourism. And the Chinese going out to invest in Thailand and Southeast Asia, I think this trend will accelerate. So it will be more amidst the trade war between US and China, because right now the tone in China is to find new market, and that new market first and foremost is Southeast Asia and including Thailand. Now we talk a lot about overcapacity and the fact that the global economy is imbalanced in a way that the US is focused on consumption, right? And China is focused on manufacturing. So the description is that the US consume too much and China produce too much. Well, if they trade with one another, it can be complementary. The Chinese produce goods and the US buy their goods, but now they don't want to trade with one another. And for the US, it's quite interesting because from what I heard from Richard, it seems that the US is now more similar to the Chinese in terms of their policy. So it's quite ironic, right? It's quite funny because we always say that China doesn't change to be similar to the West, but actually US trade policies and US industrialization, remanufacturing, industrial policies now resemble the Chinese. They have all these subsidies, mechanisms, have these new industrial policies. They want to rekindle the manufacturing sector. So they want to move from consumption to manufacturing to investment. While the critique to the Chinese is that they need to consume more, right? They need, Ajahn Thitinan said, well, they're not buying. They need to consume more. They need to emphasize the consumption aspect of their economy. But I'm sorry to report that that's not the winning narrative, Professor Thitinan, in China. There's debate in China about the importance of consumption, whether you need to transition from an investment-led economy to a consumption-driven economy. But it seems that the winning camp in this Chinese debate is actually the investment camp. So I actually predict that they will double down on investment, double down on manufacturing, not moving towards consumption. And there are a couple of reasons for this. The first reason is that it's very, very difficult to boost consumption and to see real progress in the short term. So with the slowing down and the challenges in the Chinese economy, their policy recommendations to the government is actually to boost investment. That's easily proven in the past to be effective. That can have a very straightforward impact on their growth number, and it seems to be that it can guarantee certain level of success. But there's a lot of skepticism about boosting consumption, whether it's going to be effective, whether the Chinese will consume or just put money in the bank. So basically on the policy recommendation level, it's still doubling down on investment. The second point is that the Chinese, they have this view and this argument that by doing investment, doing technological upgrade, in the end, it will help raising the level of income of the Chinese middle class, and that will translate for long term to consumption. But more importantly, they certainly believe that manufacturing investment will help with the tech war with the US. As Richard mentioned, there's this strong sense that in order for you to win the tech war, you can't only have design. You cannot just design company made in Shenzhen, right? That's not going to work. You have to do both design and manufacturing. You cannot compete if you don't have the manufacturing base. So in the Chinese policy circle, there's this strong belief that if they do their investment, their manufacturing, it will help them to gain victory in this tech war with the US. And then the last point, that's why they double down on investment is about security issue, right? They think that they can self-sustain, and they have seen experience from the US, as Richard mentioned, that you have to rely on China, on drugs, pharmaceutical, rare earth. But if the Chinese can be self-sustained and can do their own manufacturing, this really have big implications on their security concerns. On Thailand, the talking point about all this, Professor Titinan, that the flows of Chinese investment, all these problems, all these concerns about Chinese investment in the country, Chinese overcapacity. People often talk or refer to the Japanese experience, in the past. You will heard a lot of business leaders telling the forum like this that, oh, this is natural. In the past, when Japan first came to Thailand, we saw similar problems, we saw similar concerns about Japanese investment and about the benefits that the Thai economy will gain from the Japanese investment. But as time passed, the Japanese actually adapt to the Thai environment. They help build the Thai supply chain in automobile industry, car parts, a lot of SMEs, Thai local SMEs have developed from the Japanese investment. So for long term, it would be more efficient for them to use Thai supply chains, for them to help build the local SMEs to integrate with the Japanese supply chain. And the same would happen with China. They hope, in the long term that once the Chinese adapt to this new environment, they will see that it would be more efficient to use the Thai suppliers, and then they will help together with the Thais to build our own supply chains, and we will benefit from Chinese investment long term. That's the narrative. Now, I'm not so sure that that would be true in the Chinese case because of the three reasons. The first one is that the scale is very different, the scale of China and the scale of Japan. Right? China is so large and the scale is so vast that for Japanese, they need to build the local supply chain because they don't have the scale in Japan. But for China, they have everything there. The second point is that the supply chain in these new industries that China is investing in Thailand is very short compared to the long supply chain of the Japanese investment. The Japanese investment of the automobile industry have long supply chain of various car parts. For EV industries, that's battery and then the car, right? So it doesn't have such long supply chains that you can build. And the third point is the lack of skilled labor in Thailand. with all this Chinese investment now in high tech, in new industries, they would require high skilled labor, and I don't think that we have, with our education system and with our demographic problem, can produce enough skilled labor to sustain these industries. Just a very short note about the prospects of US and China trade war. I think that what's going on right now is that both sides are buying time. I think it would be disruptive and would be impossible for both sides to stop trading with one another suddenly, right? So as Scott Bessent, the Secretary of Treasury, said that we don't want trade embargo, right? Why don't they want trade embargo? Because it would be too disruptive and impossible to do. The US still need rare earth from China. China still needs the chip design software from the US. Both still rely a lot heavily on one another, so they need time. So the trade truce between these two countries, the trade deal that Trump has already tweeted that it's done, right? They have already finished negotiating, just waiting for President Trump and President Xi to sign. Well, the trade truce is very similar to the Geneva deal previously. Nothing changed substantively. It's mainly the trade truce, meaning that you just gain more time from the both sides' perspective. But I don't think it doesn't change the large direction of decoupling, because right now the major policy of China is to diversify away from the US and the West, and that's the same policy for the US, is to diversify away from China to other markets. So during the trade truce, they are not going to trade more with one another. They're not going to resume trading, right? But they are, for the US, they will ask Australia to build the rare earth supply chain. And for China, they will try to do their own chip software design, but also, from both sides' perspective, from the West, from the US is to diversify away from the Chinese market continuously, and from China is to diversify away from the US market progressively. And I think that would be the trend going forward. Despite there's a deal between China and the US in the short term, the trend is decoupling. And I also would like to follow up on Professor Titinan's point that this is, in the US, it's something larger than Trump. It's Trump, the movement. But I want to add the final point here, that it's not only Trump, the movement is now already bipartisan agreement in the US. I just watched an interview by Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan and one of the leading candidates in the Democrat Party to run for president the next time. And she went on television, interestingly, to say that she agreed with the tariffs policy. She agreed with remanufacturing in the US. Of course, she needs to say that because she ran Michigan. They need reindustrialization. And she agreed on isolating China. She just doesn't agree with the implementation of the Trump government. She wanted something more similar to the Biden's administration, more targeted tariff. Don't tariff your allies or your partners, more sectoral tariffs, more progressive, gradual tariffs. Right? She wanted remanufacturing from subsidies, not trade war, and she wanted to isolate China by bringing together American allies and partners. So the aim the policy aim is the same. Right? So I don't think that if Trump is stepping down, we have new Democratic leadership or new established Republican, things will change. I think it has already become bipartisan consensus within the US. So with that, the world has shifted, and I think the direction going forward will be deglobalization, decoupling, and then for Thailand, we will need to think more, and I will be happy to talk more in the next round about our own policy implications. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajahn. Very rich and comprehensive. Very quickly, and I think it's a good point to make about, and it's one of our takeaways today, I think, about the nature of the Japanese investments in Thailand in the late 1980s. It basically became the basis of Thai manufacturing, as opposed to Chinese investment now. A very different kind, a much shorter supply chain, and also your third point about that, about how we may not have the workforce skill to accommodate or capitalize on this new wave of Chinese investment. And in fact, it's a worry because now Chinese investment in the auto sector, for example, which is 11% of Thai GDP, is being hollowed out because of the Chinese EVs. But my quick question, Ajahn. So, I mean, China, if now we're going to have a problem here in the world, there's going to be a big glut. There's going to be a lot of people making things, and a lot of suppliers, a lot of makers, producers, but not as many consumers and buyers. But for China, if they don't consume more, how would their economy grow? I mean, innovation they've been talking about, but they've been talking about domestic consumption as well as a big market. You know, if no one outside buys, Chinese will buy inside China. You think that could happen? I mean, would that take? How could that happen? The Chinese leadership would have to kickstart it or really kind of direct that outcome, right? And then the other thing, very quickly, can the U.S. and China just have a grand bargain? So they agree on everything and on the big things, and then everything comes down. They just divide up the world.
Thank you very much, Kap. So two points here. One on Chinese consumption. So one is about the long-term prospects, right? I think the belief now is still that if they can continue with their technological upgrade, their industrial upgrade, in the end, it will translate long-term to the higher level of income, and that will translate long-term to consumption. That's their argument right now, and we can be skeptical about that. But on the short term, Professor Titinan, and this relates to tourism, the decrease in tourism from China and the Chinese investment. I think that right now the problem is confidence. It's about economic confidence. It's about the sentiment of Chinese consumers. If you look this year, actually prior to April the 2nd, so prior to this Liberation Day by President Trump, actually the real estate market in China has already improved and get back on track. You know, we see new buyers in big real estate markets in Shanghai and in other first-tier cities. But after April, it went downhill again because of the sentiment, the consumer sentiment, because of the trade war, right? And China is a big market multiplied by 1.4 billion people. So when the sentiment of consumers are good, as in the past, China can buy, right? China can consume. But when everything go downhill, when the sentiment is bad, it's worse than other countries because you times this large scale of consumers. And then, what's the second question?
U.S. China agree on everything. Grand bargain.
Okay. grand bargain, I don't think it's possible. We can see the grand bargain with Trump and Xi, but I don't think that deal can hold. Right? It would be similar to the phase one agreement, where they agree, and then they cannot actually fulfill their promise.
Thank you, Ajahn. I mean, on the spectrum of U.S.-China, on the one hand, if they have a complete agreement on the major issues, that'll be kind of a G2 so-called, and on the opposite end is a war, coming war between U.S. and China. We already see a geoeconomic war. Maybe it's a matter of time before we see military conflict, and right now we're in between in this continuum. Thank you, Ajahn, very much. Very, very insightful. Let me move to our third speaker, Professor Pavida Pananon from Thammasat Business School. Geoeconomic war. I mean, the global economy is really being shaken. I mean, the way that things used to work, produce, consume, supply chains, and we had a good run. Roughly from 1991, the demise of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, to, let's say, the Trump first administration, Trump election 2016, 25 years of globalization, which means interdependence, economic integration. You can produce, you can sell, you can go, borderless world at the lowest cost, just in time, kind of production. But now, in the last 10 years, is just in case, interdependence, economic interdependence has become economic insecurity. This is phenomenal, I mean, in my lifetime. And it has shaken up the supply chains and, the value chain in the global economy. So now what's being produced would have to kind of, be diverted or reshaped according to the geostrategic contours. So what does that mean for Southeast Asia, for Thailand, Ajahn Pavida?
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Titinan, and thank you, ISIS, for having me here today. It's not easy to be put on the hat of the business and the economic against three very leading hardcore international relations and geopolitics speakers. But let me try. I was asked to address the geoeconomics conflict. And it kind of made me think that, normally I do research on international business. And in international business, we already see economics activities as geoeconomics because it has to be based on where you go, what you want to do. You want to go make things where it is cheapest, most effective, and most efficient. But now you are seeing that kind of logic has been challenged. Geoeconomics has moved from positive sum game to a zero sum game in the way that we see it. And then, so we are actually seeing the shift in the logic that define what economic relationship should be between countries. And so I think that I would try to address the questions that you posed, as well as try to explain how that shift is affecting to other countries. Normally, Dr. Titinan doesn't usually like PowerPoint, so he said that if we are to use PowerPoint, just use it for illustrative reason. So I try to do that. So I have only kind of the letters and the contents on 2 slides, which is the same thing, the takeaways that I would put up first, and then I would try to use some kind of graphic to illustrate the points that I want to make. So just to bring up first of what I want to say here today is that first, geoeconomic conflict is not just about trade war, and it's not just about trade in final products like canned tuna, computer, but it is also about how those supply chains are linked in the stage of intermediate products. How semiconductor in this computer is being made somewhere and then traded to other countries. it is also about foreign direct investment, because those trades are not done by national government and domestic governments, but the trades that exist in the world today exist majorly in the majority of trade is the trade in intermediate products. That means Toyota is selling car parts in Malaysia to Toyota in Thailand to assembly. And then the car that is manufactured and assembly in Thailand is then sold to Australia for some. So that's the kind of the nature of trade that involve not just the government to decide what is done where. So with that point, the actors and decision makers in this kind of geoeconomic conflicts is not just about the state, but it is also about the industry and the firms. And I think that point is quite significant because it can come in to explain why China might want to buy time or why countries might want to take a wait and see approach. Because Trump may be able to make decision on tariff in one day by signing the presidential order. But companies cannot just relocate their factories that involve billions of dollars just by following what Trump is doing in the presidential tariff. So I think that's the second point that I would like to bring in to the discussion. So implication for countries in Southeast Asia and Thailand in particular is that it's not just about trade negotiation for tariff reduction, but it also how one position oneself in the global supply chain of things that can increase your leverage and your bargaining power. And with those 3 points, I would now like to illustrate with the different issues that I want to share with you today. The first one is the graph that shows how the world has grown in the past from the 1990s that Dr. Titinan has mentioned, all the way to past, it stopped at 2019, but I think it already captures a good sense of what I would like to address here. If you look at the period where I circle in red, that's between somewhat like early 90s, late 80s, all the way to the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. And the line, the graph that shows in there, the green one is the foreign direct investment, and the orange line is the growth of trade. And the dot line is the GDP growth of the world. And the graph in gray that you see is the growth of the global value chain, or now we hear it more as global supply chain. I've been working on researching in global value chain for some years, and it's kind of exciting in a way that usually when I said, I do work on global value chain and all that, and people go like, yeah, global value chain, what's that? Where you manufacture and logistic and all that. But now, all of a sudden, kind of geopolitical concerns make global supply chain and global value chain kind of more sexy and more exciting in a way. So this graph is just to show you how we used to think of things differently, and that makes the concept on global value chain differ in different periods. If you look at the period that I said, I circle in red, that's actually the period that Southeast Asia grew significantly. Thailand recorded the fastest growth in 1987 with 12% GDP. That's like long in the past. We cannot get there again anytime soon or ever. And that's because we kind of follow the export-led development model where we produce the things that we assemble, produce, and then we sell things to outside. In a way, it's made here, sold there, made in Thailand, made in Southeast Asia, but sold back to the big market for consumption, EU, Japan, and the US. So that was the kind of the model that we see. And that economic model was actually driven by a shared logic between the global north and the global south countries. Why share? Because at that time, the decision on global value chain was made by the efficiency. Companies in the West, companies in Europe and in America look for where they would do their activities that makes them most efficient. And that's why they relocate to countries that are cheaper in labor costs for production. And that's why the foreign direct investment flow come to countries in Southeast Asia at first. And then at that time, Thailand was pretty much among the leading countries in Southeast Asia that attract a lot of foreign direct investment. And we successfully export our way to growth. But I think for that, no country is more successful in following the export-driven growth model than China. Because China is the country that, after China joined WTO in 2001, China has become the factory of the world and export a lot of things to the rest of the world, not just final product, but also the intermediate products that other countries need. And with that, China has become the big player that not only supply some of the parts to the Southeast Asian who doesn't have the kind of scale to produce at the scale that China can, and therefore not the same lower cost that China can produce. And we can see that with that world, the world economic links in all industrial sectors. If you look on the top part, that's 1995, but the bottom part is the same figures for 2015. And I know, sorry that it is quite small, but what I just want to explain is that if you see the node on the top part, the node that we see between the two biggest countries that have economic linkage were between Japan and US. That's for the 1995. But when you look at the lower picture and you see the flow, you can see the thickness of the link, and that signifies the amount of the relationship and economic links between those two countries. So if you look at that, you would see the three main nodes being China on the left-hand side of the lower picture, and then the US. And the top one there is rest of the world. Where does Asia, Southeast Asia fit in? Southeast Asia fit in with Japan at the kind of the top left there, becoming one part of this kind of a bigger picture. And the Southeast Asia having been linked to China in that picture. So with this kind of picture, it will be very difficult to undo this. And here is some evidence of recent kind of arguments that show that yes, the US and China ties and economic links have diminished, but they haven't really decoupled or uncoupled, or at least not yet. If you look at this graph, you would see the graph, the bar graph, and the zero. The zero that you see kind of on the far right, that signifies the same amount, but measured in the year 2016. But the graph that you see on the left-hand side is the same measure that measured the amount in 2023. And this connectivity are divided into 4 types: trade, capital, which refers to investment, and information, data, service, and all that, and people. So if you see this graph, what this graph tells you is that, yes, the link between these two countries have diminished quite somewhat, but they are still the two countries with very strong, I'm trying to go back here. These are still the two countries with the strongest economic activities together. So in a way, it will not be easy, or at least it will take time to completely decouple. So this is where we stand in Southeast Asia. We look at this, and the left-hand side is the power index done by the Lowy Institute in Australia, measuring which kind of country that we consider as powerful. And this power not just include the economic power, but also security in terms of armed force and everything. And as you can see, from the Asia perspective, you can see the big one being the US, China, India, and Australia, of course, has to be there because they're the one funding the research for this in a way. So is there. Sorry if there's an Australian embassy representing. That was a joke. And then the big picture on the right-hand side is we don't want to choose. Why don't we want to choose? Because we depend on both sides. On the one hand, we depend on China for a lot of the intermediate product that flow into the manufacturing that is done in Thailand. On the other hand, we also want to sell to the US and to the others. So that's why it's difficult to choose. And with the kind of the conflict that goes on between China and the US, it gives at first, before the Liberation Day, before the reciprocal rate, tariff rate announcement, Southeast Asia was actually positive about the kind of conflict that was going on, because we think that we would be the one benefiting from the China plus one. In Thai, we want to be the one benefit from somlon, or meaning that, the kind of the orange falling on us, not apple on us, but it means that, everyone have problem, but then it becomes beneficial to us. Because if you look at this graph, I know that it's small, but it shows China trade increasing between different countries. And for most countries, for the US, it's the light blue line in the bottom on the left-hand side. Kind of slow down China trade with the US. But then China trade with certain countries like Mexico or Vietnam has been on the up. So the top blue one is Mexico right there, whereas Vietnam is not presented in this graph. I took this from Financial Times. And the right-hand side, it shows where Chinese investment has been going in the year from 2019 to 2024. And the pink color represents Singapore. The blue color that is quite big is Hungary. And the light blue one is Mexico, and the dark kind of green one in the bottom is Vietnam. So what you see there is that these are the countries that benefit from China trying to relocate away from China because of the more hostile economic environment that they face if they export out of China. So that's the kind of the thing that Thailand was hopeful that we could be the China plus one in Southeast Asia. So BOI is going prepare the EEC and more tax and financial incentive and all that. But now this has become more difficult because of the reciprocal tariff. You cannot just kind of locate to one country and it becomes more competitive, as Dr. Titinan has mentioned. So this is my last two slides, just to give you a picture of why companies matter and why sometimes consumption alone is not the main principle and the main mechanism. Because when you look at different industry, this is an overall picture for the semiconductor. If you look at the different stage of semiconductor and you look at where value is created, these are not the same that, the value is created in the manufacturing. Most of the value captured in the semiconductor is captured in the R&D stage. So if countries that can capture that kind of the value added stage of the supply chain, they can certainly have more economic value in that sense compared to what we see in the right-hand side. That is the stage that Thailand kind of hope that we can get in there. Assembly and packaging of semiconductor, which adds only about 6% to the value of the whole thing, whereas R&D creates as high as 53%. And this is another picture that would show why it is very difficult that to undo the geoeconomic links. This is the stage where semiconductors start to be produced before it becomes something that it can end up as a phone, Apple phone. In this graph, they use the example of Argentina right here as the final consumption of the iPhone. But before that, many things have to take place. Machine from the Netherlands to produce the kind of the finest and the thinnest semiconductor chip that can be produced. And it goes back to the US for a certain stage and then crisscross all over the world. So basically this graph tells you that for something like computer or something that looks kind of simple for us to buy, the things that goes behind goes a lot deeper and a lot more complex than we see. And that brings me again to my final 3 points to share with you today. That when we look at the global supply chain that used to be once driven by efficiency logic, that is shared more among countries. Now we are seeing the global value chain being driven more by the security embedded interest that makes the ability of countries to turn the supply chain into weapon. And I think that a great example that we have seen in today's world have been rare earth mineral and all the kind of the minerals. Now it's not just rare earth because rare earth might be more important for mobile phone, but some other minerals that are now needed for defense are being kind of weaponized. Who controls what and who mine the deposits in different countries. And that leads to China in a lot of sense. So that's one industry. Second industry is the semiconductor as shown here, because that has a lot more commercial use to our everyday life. Third is pharmaceutical. That was more pronounced during COVID, but now a little forgotten now, but it's still very important. And I think with this, countries have to kind of rethink their position along the global value chain. What kind of value proposition that they can offer? Malaysia is doing semiconductor diplomacy to say that they are also an option for all this. But where does Thailand stand in the kind of the supply chain that supplies to the world? Is there anywhere that we can kind of look to enhance our leverage and our value proposition so that we would become resilient from the sense of the supplier country? And that's why I think it's not just about trade negotiation to get the tariff rate down, but it makes us have to think where we position ourselves in the global supply chain. And that's kind of saddened me that, the ministry that is now most significant for Thailand is actually Ministry of Interior, rather than Ministry of something exterior. Thinking about all this, we have been more looking inward rather than trying to see what we do inward really carries forward and outward what we can do outside. And that's, thank you very much for.
Thank you, Ajahn Pavida. Thank you very much. Very sobering assessment. At the end of it, Thailand, you realize from this presentation that Thailand has really fallen behind. It's getting lost on the geoeconomic contours of the world. I just have a quick one. You mentioned so now the distinction between governments talking about geoeconomics, geopolitics, but in fact the real actors that actually do the production are these companies, firms. And you mentioned that China and US and X. So, governments are a big headache for firms because firms would like to have a borderless world. They want to invest, they want to trade, they want to produce, so for them, the best, the ideal world is not to have all these borders, all these tariffs and protectionism. But now it's gone the other way. Governments are very heavily intervening and raising tariffs and so on. It's a very adverse environment for companies. When you say China, US, X, so for multinationals along the value chains, still have to make things in China, right? But do you mean that they also need to make things in the US? Or where do they make these things? And then finally, decoupling, this is a very good point, decoupling is very hard to do. The systems that were uncoupled was the Soviet Union and the US. That was an uncoupled system. So you have the US, you have Europe and so on, and then you have the Soviet Union. But for China, US is so enmeshed. And now you're saying, okay, now you have to like separate, you have to decouple. So very hard, but up to a point they can do that. But to what, up to which point? I mean, how far can this go? And there'll be a crackdown. The US will crack down on Mexico and Vietnam and all these countries that make things that sell to the US. So maybe it's a matter of time we'll see more and more decoupling. What do you think?
Yes, I think we will start to see more decoupling because two reasons. One is the US is driving that by using industrial policy to incentivize companies to come to the US. So that goes into what I said by China, US plus X. We used to think that the world need a China plus X. So companies can go out of China to serve the rest of the world. But now the US wants to control a lot of the whole entire value chain of industry. Like they are trying to make TSMC to invest in the US because US has other things that is already there. So the plus X becomes, what do the rest of the world do? Many industry cannot just be in one country because I think the trust in the system that you make here and sold there is being heavily challenged by this. And many countries are trying to reshore or bring the supply chain closer to their control, not just because of the problem with US, China, but because of the problem of longer supply chain. We witnessed during COVID when there was an accident in the Panama Canal, and then a lot of trade got stuck because of that. So the interest in a shorter supply chain makes even EU more sensitive about what they do within the region. Actually, sorry for a little bit of promotion. I just been working a lot on this paper that look at the integration of industrial policy and global value chain. For any of you who are interested, it will appear in Journal of International Business Policy. And because I edit this with the leading global value chain scholar, Gary Jereffi out of the US, and we have 7 papers that address this theme. One of the paper is on the antibiotics shortage in Sweden. All of a sudden, Sweden realized that their dependence on key pharmaceutical like antibiotics is very much dependent on companies that are done outside. So Sweden is trying to look at policies to bring back by different policies, reshoring into the EU area and everything. So now we are seeing the world becoming more looking at each other as how do we promote the control of supply chain and the autonomy of the supply chain. And I think that kind of add to an answer to your questions on why the plus X and whether the decoupling would happen. It will probably happen slowly, but who can do that? That means that smaller countries like ours is very difficult to do that because we don't have the kind of the regional mechanism. We have ASEAN, but ASEAN is actually more competitive against each other when it comes to economic interests. So that's the kind of the challenge that we face as small countries.
Okay, thank you very much. I think there are some students, July students in the room. I just say, the extreme opposite of all of this is self-reliant autarky with no trade. That's the ultimate security. That's the teaser. But that's not going to happen, of course. Let me, Ajahn Titipat, deliberately leave you as the last speaker to be our kind of a panel sweeper, which means that you can react to any of the points made, and we've kind of dived into some of the granular issues about U.S., China, U.S. inside U.S. political economy, China, and Southeast Asia, Thailand. But in a broader, maybe stepping back a little bit, John, geostrategic environment. You have now theaters of conflict in Russia, Ukraine, that's still ongoing, and then you have now the Middle East. The U.S. is directly involved, and then nearby we have Myanmar in Southeast Asia, even Thai-Cambodian border dispute has become a crisis in Thailand. Taiwan Strait, a lot of conflicts now. What do you make of this? I mean, for U.S., China, and Southeast Asia, Thailand, medium, longer term? For about.
Okay, thank you very much, Thitinan, and thanks for having me. So speaking after these three distinguished colleagues and friends, I think it makes my talk a little bit challenging, if not difficult, but because they have covered many aspects, important aspects of geopolitical and geoeconomic. So I'd like to maybe zoom out a little bit and shed light on the big picture and the future prospect of geopolitical, geoeconomic, and also geostrategic competition. I like the term of the title of the forum today, the term turbulence. I think the term turbulence is the accurate description of global politics right now. Okay, if we use the metaphor of plane, I think we have no American pilot in charge or in control. And also there are problems with engines, difficult engines, like wars, consumptions, investment and production, and stagnation that affect the plane in general as a kind of a geo-body of our world politics right now. We survive sometimes perhaps due to the system, the autopilot system that we might have. So we are living in an uncertain and dangerous time. The psychology and emotions of anger, frustration, competition are lingering on in so many ways. Okay, wars happen in many places: Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, Israel, Iran. While a prospect of Taiwan war loom large, Pete Hegseth, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, mentioned that the Shangri-La Dialogue, that 2027 will be the key point, a key turning point in, that China might launch the war. Global crisis is now a poly crisis, okay, with multiplicities of players and challenges, and tend to be perma crisis as well. The nature of perma crisis is permanency, radical uncertainties, and secure economic nexus. Okay, this point I think to add on Professor Pawida's great presentation, I think she is right to say that trade war nowadays is not only about trade in goods, but also I think it's about global supply chain, and also economic issue and security issue are interrelated. These are so complex interdependence. Think about rare earth, about lithium that are used not only for the civilian but also for defense technologies. So we see a kind of this competition that's raised in geopolitical and geoeconomic dimension. But one of my caveats is that I think geopolitics is largely about power. It's a power relations, pure and simple nowadays, how to influence each other and also to shape the global politics and global order in particular. I have some key takeaways, probably 4 key takeaways that might render kind of a more pessimistic picture about world politics right now, rather than a kind of optimistic view, okay, that we are living in and on. So 4 points. I think one, global trade war is important, but I think it is the tip of the iceberg. Okay, there are other undercurrents underneath that I think the future prospect we need, as a future prospect, we might need to take into consideration. Number 2, the geopoliticization of everything. Geopolitics is everywhere, and everything is geopoliticized. Number 3, I think geoeconomics need to be seen as a tool of statecraft that geopolitics right now use. Okay, so in other words, geoeconomic is not a separate issue, but it's part and parcel of geopolitical rivalry of power. So we see what we call geoeconomic weaponization, or some call it weaponized interdependence. Okay, the 4th point that I would like to make is that global issues are securitized and militarized all across the world in many theaters of conflict and warfare. Okay, so let's start with the first one. Okay, I think many speakers, Dr. Tinan mentioned about Trump as a man and Trumpism as a movement. I think they are important destabilizing factors, but they are not the only factor. Okay, and it is a result. They are the result of something before, something that happened before, like a global shift toward geopolitics. And from this point of view, we can see that there's a continuity from Trump 1.0 to Biden and Trump 2.0. With it might be a different in degree, but not in kind. Ajahn mentioned about the bipartisan consensus. I agree that the China as a strategic competitor is all around in Washington. Okay, Democrat and Republican might disagree on other things, but on China, I think they are on the same page. Okay, Trump as a factor, I think accelerate the crisis of world order that we are living in and on. We are overwhelmed with the surface of geopolitical competition, which is the global trade war, especially around in Indo-Pacific. The weaponization of trade and tariff, or what scholars call weaponized interdependence, loom large in the region and beyond. I think it's important and serious matter, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. Amid the stormy trade war, there are geopolitical undercurrents that shape our future competition. Let me elaborate on this point a little bit. If you think about maybe a kind of the way the Titanic illustrates to us, okay, we hit the tip of the iceberg, but the undercurrent, the whole iceberg, consists not only the trade war, but tech war. Okay, tech war that might include chip war, cloud war, and cyber war. Okay, when we think about the production of the iPhone is one thing, but in the future, I think it will go to the cloud system. Okay, two different cloud systems that bifurcate the world into at least two systems. Okay, China-led one, and also the Western-led one. Okay, and we see the AI war that coming in. A network war that has been orchestrated in many areas like infrastructure, the undersea cables, for example, digital platform, production of global supply chains, as well as the financial geopolitics that many started to think about, to question about the dollarization in the world. Okay, like BRICS try to contest the dollar supremacy since the Second World War onwards. And we have the not only the network war, but real war that happened on the grounds in many parts of the world. So geopolitics in the future, I think, will be about this struggle for resource, network, and supremacies in the years to come. That is first takeaway. That I think we might need to think about this global trade war as just the tip of the iceberg. Okay, the geopolitical undercurrents will escalate more in the future. My second takeaway is about the process that we might call geopoliticization of everything. The eras that we normally familiar with globalization is replaced by the new era of geopolitics. So I think we have seen a seismic global paradigm shift from the first G of globalization to the second G of geopolitics. And the win-win logic of globalization has been challenged by the winner takes all or zero-sum game of great power competition. I think this marked the new era of economic warfare. Unlike the Cold War, that both US and USSR were mutually quite independent. Economic interdependence or complex interdependence, the mantra of Chimerica, is no longer a charm at all. Okay, but it interlinked with great power economies and relations today. In this era, great powers therefore could exploit choke points and nodes to pressure rivals as well as friends in this situation. Complex interdependence has been replaced by decoupling, de-risking, diversification, and more importantly, I think, friendshoring. Okay, the global supply chain has been bifurcated into like-minded states that produce for the US or for China, and so on and so forth. This is not yet a deglobalized world, but a kind of demarcated and perhaps demoralized world It's a bifurcated world, if not perhaps bipolarity at the top of the multipolar or multiplex world right now. G2 that Dr. Tinian mentioned, I think the nature of G2 is not cooperative, but rather competitive in this situation. Okay. The third key takeaway, I think the rise of geoeconomic tools of statecraft or weaponized interdependence loom large in our current geopolitics. Despite the grand bargain, okay, Trump and Xi are able for now to conclude the tariff settlement. However, Sino-US relations are at a low ebb. China and US are competing over who will be atop the geopolitical pecking order. US has its global lead in finance and technology, but China increasingly catching up with the US. But Washington is trying to kick away the latter, okay, by using the global trade war and other weaponized interdependence to curb, challenge, and contain China. I think this is economic warfare, okay, or geoeconomic conflicts that has been dominate the global political economy right now. I think we will see a kind of changing from one battlefield to another battlefield. Okay, war on terror, okay, in the past decades and also to another economic battlefields right now. Choke points and nodes are bifurcate and decouple and so on and so forth. So we see a kind of changing geopolitical chessboard. Okay, in particular, the Indo-Pacific chessboard that has been securitized and militarized, which will be another point that I would like to share with you about the security dynamics of Indo-Pacific region, okay, which is radically uncertain. Despite its radical uncertainty, Indo-Pacific will be the most contested strategic region for great power rivalry. I think this is largely due to, number one, the intense Sino-US rivalry in this part of the world, but also the Trump factor that render the alignment commitment problematic, okay, highly problematic, because it questions not only the relationship with alliance, but also the reluctance to sustain the liberal rule-based order or liberal international order. I think if you look at Trump's narratives in the world right now with alliance, I think Pete Hegseth again talk about tough love, okay, in relationships with allies and partners. I'm not sure which part is the priority, the love or the toughness. It probably the toughness that come before the love with the partners. I think this will have the major repercussion and impact on countries in Southeast Asia, including Thailand. I think two key points, or three maybe. Number one is about the burden sharing activities. Okay, so in other words, countries in the region need to spend more on defense. Number two, U.S. would urge the upgrading. Okay, would urge upgrading of the military. So it means buying more from the U.S. And number three, I think we see the pressure to choose side will be more intense in this global political, geopolitical rivalry. Okay, friendshoring. Okay, not only in economic global supply chains that my colleagues have already laid out brilliantly, but also about security alignment as well. That the U.S. would put pressure on. Okay, this is in the nature of this geopolitical competition. And also, last but not least, the militarization of regional security has been intense as well. Okay, there are many key flashpoints, such as the South China Sea, East China Sea, the Strait of Taiwan, which have become, turn out to be military hotspots. They involve not only local, literal players, but also major powers inside and outside the region. I think this risks unnecessary escalation and accidental showdowns looming large. The latest TUSO in the South China Sea happened in late April when China has sought to assert its claims over the small reef known as Sandy Cay Rift. On the other hand, strategic alignment is complicated, the conflict as well. Similar to the transatlantic partnership, the US-led hub and spoke system, which previously served as a deterrent, now encounters the commitment or abandon crisis. In addition, the proliferation of WMDs further complicates military balance and regional peace and stability. The Pyongyang nuclearization and the rise of nuclear power submarines, as well as the global nuclear competition, more or less threaten the Southeast Asia, in particular the Southeast Asian Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone Treaty, or SHONFES, which should be strengthened rather than bypassed. In conclusion, I think we have seen a seismic global paradigm shift from the first G of globalization to the second G of geopolitics. US under Trump no longer serves as a liberal hegemony, but still want to gain a preponderance of power in terms of military and economic strength. America first, sometimes it's not America alone, but I think it's not an isolationism, but unilateralism that the US would like to project in the world, okay? And rather than upholding the multilateral diplomacy and cooperation, Trump's US trying to bypass it and use other means like minilateralisms and bilateralisms in order to curb and contain the rise of China, as well as to curb many allies and partners as well. China, on the other hand, emerged as a near-peer competitor to American primacies in the Indo-Pacific chess game. But the question whether China is ready to step up to be a kind of pilot in our turbulent plane is not yet clear. From the secondary powers, geopolitics is the new rules of the game that pressure and push us to choose sides. But one thing is clear, my last word is that the worst case scenario is that there will be no winner taking all in this geopolitical competition. In other words, I think it's not good for anyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kapachan Titipat. Interesting what you said about Pete Hegseth. His speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue, he referred to China as communist China. He used the word communist 4 times. And that's a bit of a giveaway. And when you see people refer to China as the PRC, that's not very friendly. So basically, the thrust of your presentation really is we have a geopolitical conflict being fought in the geoeconomic arena, in a way, right? I want to open the floor now for comments and questions. We have about 15 minutes. But when we come back to you, Ajahn Titipat, maybe you can just say, if you have any idea when this seismic shift took place, the world was actually going well. Globalization and US, China were great. I mean, US and China were very close. US supported China to enter the WTO and everything. When did it turn south and became sour? I'll just leave that with you when we come back to you. The floor is open to questions, comments. We have about almost 15 minutes. Anyone? Ambassador Kasit. Anyone else? I'm going to take a round. And then the gentleman in the back. Okay, we'll start with Ambassador Kasit. I'd have to ask you to be concise, unfortunately, because of time. Thank you very much.
The first question is, the US will never allow anyone to challenge it. And the question is, will the US be able to maintain its primacy or preponderance? And is there, in that sense, a limitation to the Chinese ability? That's the first question. Second, there are maybe 5 markets area for Thailand and ASEAN. North and South America in one, the Europe second, then China, Northeast Asia, and so on. Okay, then the ASEAN itself. but none of you have mentioned about the possibility of more inward-looking ASEAN integration, enlargement, and becoming less dependent on the other 4 or 5 major world markets. Would that be a possibility at all? Thank you.
Thank you very much. 2 questions. First, I think for us in international relations, very familiar question. There can only be one number one. And is this all about really the US being number one? The second is a good one on, can there be more intra-ASEAN trade? And we've seen a little bit of increase in intra-ASEAN investment, but intra-ASEAN trade is about 22% over the last 30 years, really. But maybe the ASEAN Economic Community, maybe we can upgrade the RCEP, or maybe the answer is around here within ASEAN, given what's happened in the world. I'll take a question or comment from the gentleman in the back.
Thank you very much.
Please tell us who you are first, yeah.
My name is Jeremy Furchgott. Based in Washington, D.C., I advise U.S. companies in the U.S. Department of Defense on U.S.-China competition. I have a question for the panel about Thailand's role in U.S.-China competition relative to other ASEAN countries. There's been a lot of discussion about the Thai economy and the role of Thailand in global supply chains. Many of the comments that have been made about Thailand's position, I think, could be made about other countries. And I'm curious whether anyone on the panel has any specific views on significant differences between Thailand's position and other countries in Southeast Asia that have a similar position in global supply chains. Are there relative winners and losers within ASEAN?
Okay, in terms of geopolitics, some people in Washington think that Thailand has gone to China, like Laos and Cambodia and maybe Myanmar, maybe Brunei. But on the supply chains, a different kind of question, whether they'll be more competitive in Southeast Asia vis-a-vis US, China, and where in that mix, in that continuum, China and Thailand is positioned. Any other question or comment? We can take one more. Please.
Hi, so to add on to the previous question, so I was wondering whether
Can you tell us who you are?
Good morning. I'm like a fresh graduate from Chulalongkorn University from International Relations Department. So my question is, as Thailand is losing its competitive edge, as we're seeing from the seminars, then what can Thailand do in this geopolitical rivalry to survive as we are facing both external and internal political turmoil? Do we still have time to rethink about our position, or is it too late?
Okay, very good way to round up the questions. How can Thailand rescue itself from all that's going on? I'm going to come down to the panel, maybe just going from Ajahn Pavida, and then each can speak for, I don't know, maybe a couple minutes, 2 or 3 minutes, all the time we have for. Ajahn Pavida, maybe the intra-ASEAN trade, can that go up? Can that compensate, offset, the US tariff and market access? And then any other thing you want to talk about, and same with the speakers. Ajahn Pavida.
Thank you. Thank you for the great questions from all of you. I think what I would say about the ASEAN is that, yes, the opportunities is there. And do we realize to try to make this an opportunities for all? So we are seeing that there are potentials in ASEAN because some of the countries in ASEAN are actually have a growth in middle class growing. The CLMV is not as aging as we are in Thailand or Singapore. So the opportunities is there. How do we then see the benefit of from made here, sold there, made in this region and sold outside, but to made here, sold around here? I think that's one key things to do. And that means that the ASEAN and the government have to look at what are the restrictions that would facilitate more intra-regional trade and investment. I think we already have a lot of rules and legislation and regulation to facilitate this, but the enforcement and the implementation would be the issue. One example is that going outward is not only China that has done that. Many in Southeast Asia, Thailand, for example, is seeing the experience of Thai companies trying to go outward in the region to benefit more from growth opportunities. But for some reason, we might see that more on a negative light, that this is a way that capital flow out of country rather than inside the country. But I think we have to look at it more as how can we benefit from intra-regional trade and investment. On the second point on what could be done for countries in this region, is it too late, and would other Southeast Asian countries share this? I think we in the Southeast Asian are in the role with regard to global supply chain more as the supplier in the various industries. So now it depends on who can make themselves a better supplier. How can you make yourself more indispensable or more important along the supply chain? I think Singapore is a good example of how they have become much more high-tech and value-added. If you look at pharmaceutical value chain, Singapore is the place where they want to locate the R&D and all that, and that becomes more significant. Malaysia is trying hard and very focused on semiconductor, trying to become the missing puzzle in this area that can rebalance the power from Taiwan. And Vietnam is very hungry, trying to upgrade to more kind of value added in the R&D as well as creating their own brand. VinFast is a good example of EV where they try that. So where does that leave Thailand? I think that's a big question.
It also depends on how the tariffs will end up. Thailand is very competitive with Malaysia on electronics, electrical products, for example. I mean, with Vietnam and Malaysia with rubber. So it also depends on the tariffs at the end of it. Richard, do you have any, as an outside observer, analyst, a view or recommendation for Thailand? Sometimes outside has a better view. And then on the US, is this about the US primacy? Primacy, to be number one.
Well, thank you for the great questions and congratulations to the recent Chulalongkorn graduate. I guess I'll try to go down the list of questions. To start on U.S. preponderance, people in this room might disagree with me or might think I'm giving too strongly American of a perspective, but I don't think the U.S. really cares as much as other people assume or people in the rest of the world assume about its global preponderance or global primacy. The U.S. became the world's leading economy in the 1880s, but the U.S. really did not want to have that much to do with the world geopolitically until really approximately 1947. Even during World War II, there were very tense debates about what the nature of U.S. involvement after the war would look like for the rest of the world, and significant political factions within the U.S. Did not want the U.S. to have really any kind of leading geopolitical stake or involvement that might involve the financial costs or the cost in terms of lives that World War II was bringing. In terms of recent competition between the U.S. and China too, I think if one goes back through the chronological record, one can find that the U.S. was really pushed into the geopolitical competition rather than jumping into it right away. Shinzo Abe, who at the time was a former and about to be, again, Japanese prime minister, in 2013 gave a very influential speech at the Hudson Institute, where he said, basically, you Americans are asleep, you need to wake up. China is pursuing what he called a Lebensraum policy. He used certainly very controversial terms for that, but it's another sign or a piece of evidence that the U.S. Was kind of brought into the geopolitical competition by events in East Asia and by pressure from some of its allies, in particular Japan and Australia. In terms of inward-looking ASEAN integration, I think that actually would satisfy Trump's position. I think Trump would be delighted if ASEAN came to rely more on internal demand rather than external demand for satisfying its economies. The problem is that's just not how ASEAN economies are currently structured. Most economies in ASEAN want to pursue or have been oriented toward pursuing as great exports as they can. And if they were to change that, that would involve pretty substantial shifts within each economy, whether that's suppressing manufacturing in each economy, whether that's economic redistribution plans that would raise consumption, raise consumer spending within each economy. So I think Trump would be happy for it, but it would be a very politically and economically painful transition. I'll defer the question on Thailand's role in US-China competition, but in terms of what can Thailand do to survive, I think there's a lot that Thailand could do to re-stimulate its economy that it maybe has been neglecting for the last 20 years. One side of Thailand having very large net financial outflows from Thailand to countries like Singapore, the United States, Vietnam, and so on, is that Thailand really hasn't invested quite enough in itself in terms of infrastructure, but also in terms of health and education. So having a bit more of a focus on improving conditions, improving support for places like Chula, Thammasat, and other universities in Thailand really could do a lot to helping re-stimulate energy and economic dynamism.
Thank you very much.
Ajahn Jitipat, a couple of minutes in reaction to the questions and comments raised, and including maybe just a tad on when did this went south?
Okay, let's start with the question of when did this turn south. I think maybe the early 2010s, maybe the decades that started to turn south in Sino-US relations. I think if you go back, I think US has been obsessed with the war on terror in the Middle East for decades or so, and then the narrative in the late Bush administration started to talk about China as a responsible power, right? That need to be responsible not only in terms of economic and security dimension. I think that's the beginning of the deterioration. And then Barack Obama started to talk about the pivot to Asia, I think in reaction to the rise and assertiveness of China, okay? But through the economic engagement with the region, through the US-led hub and spoke system. I think TPP was one of the example, which now disappear from the Washington's strategic vocabulary. But I think the key turning point would probably be the rise of Xi Jinping, 2012, 2013's idea of national rejuvenation, which means to make China great again, similar to U.S. Trump's doctrine. So I think that's rendered the big shift in U.S. strategic thinking. In terms of the document, I think in terms of the doctrine, 2017 national security strategies during Trump, I think it marked the beginning of the new narrative. Okay, the big shift from war on terror to great power competition / geopolitical competition. China has been seen as a strategic competitor for the first time, and later on the defense and intelligence community started to shape the narrative of China as a strategic threat, and so on and so forth. So I think this is to answer your question about the when. With regard to the tyrant's role in this geopolitics, I think the problem, the main constraint of Thai foreign policy is about domestic politics. Ajahn Pawida mentioned about this brilliantly, that I think is a problem, okay, for it's turned out to be a kind of inward-looking diplomacy rather than internationalist or outward-looking diplomacy. My argument is that Thailand, okay, since the coup d'etats, and so on and so forth, pursue a policy of hedging by default. Is a practice that Thailand appear to hedge with major powers, but it's an appearance. It's not a grand strategy. It's not a strategy of the country, because different organization, different bureaucracy pursue different things. Okay, some might close to China, some might close to US, some might be neutrality, right? But pursuing neutrality. So this is a kind of hedging by default that I think shape foreign policy of Thailand. Couple of key points. One, I think Thailand is playing good on one globalization game. Doing trade negotiation, FTA is the aim of many governments, but I think we are not well prepared to conduct diplomacy in a geopolitical, geoeconomic game yet. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing, I think if we want to navigate the geopolitical game smartly, we need to identify the key areas or sectors that Thailand can do, right, to turn the crisis into a kind of opportunity, okay, to play with a great power competition in a nuanced way. Three, I think Thailand needs to diversify. The world is not US and China. The world is not Sino-US competition. So I think this is another point. Last point, middle power position, I think is the new foreign policy direction that Thailand should pursue, okay, punching above the weight with a kind of internationalist perspectives and practices. And it's not only Thailand alone that can punch above the weight. Sometimes Thailand should lead from the middle as well, okay, in order to work closely with ASEAN and like-minded states, okay, to project itself as a concert of great middle powers in the changing world. I think that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ajahn. Sorry, we're a little bit over time now. I rely on Ajahn for 1 or 2 minutes of the parting remarks. Is it too late for Thailand, US, China, anything?
Thank you. I love Professor Titinan's question, when does this turn bad? But let's flip a little bit, right? From the Chinese perspective, actually this is interesting, right? Because you talk about 2010's Xi Jinping, but actually from the Chinese perspective, they just start to lose hope, completely lost hope about China-US relations, the resuming of good relations. After the tech war, during the Biden administration, the restriction of semiconductor. So it's just very recent that I think they pursue the inward-looking policy that Ambassador Kasit mentioned. ASEAN doesn't have an inward-looking policy, but China does. And China inward-looking policy are two tiers. One is domestic economy, but another is China plus ASEAN. So I think we will see more Chinese investment, more reliance, more dependence on the Chinese economy with ASEAN. Now, the final point I'm going to make is the question about the difference between Thailand versus other ASEAN countries amidst this US-China geopolitical competition. And actually, I think that the key difference is that for Thailand, we do not know clearly what are our bargaining powers. My point is that Indonesia, they know they have resources, they know they're a big economy, they know China needs them, the US needs them, same with Singapore, same with Vietnam. They all seem to be able to elaborate their strength, their bargaining powers. That doesn't seem to be the case with Thailand. So I think to say our strategy going forward, I think we have to be clear about what do we want, about what are our bargaining powers rely on, what are our strengths, and building on our strength, and then also pursue, as Professor Thitipat mentioned, the art of negotiation with all these superpowers.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very sorry that we have run over time and run out of time. I just want to say that thank all speakers again. I want to tell the students here and everyone that what has been discussed here really not just highlights and the insights, but the condensation. We have condensed a lot of ground into this panel. It can go into books and articles. So I want to thank all the speakers. I really appreciate that I can call Jan Am and Jan Thitipat and they say yes to come right away. And thanks Richard and Jan Pavida, of course. Thank you very much. Thank you.